Hi, in this lecture, I'm going to conclude our look at the third meditation by considering its role in Descartes' project overall, and I'll also consider a few objections raised to Descartes. Recall that in the third meditation, Descartes aims to prove God's existence, and that's to serve a certain sort of function, namely to support the rule that everything that we clearly and distinctly perceive, that it is true. So he wants to establish this rule, this clarity and distinctness rule, in order for that rule to be a foundational principle for inquiry and for the sciences. Proving that God exists supports that principle by the following argument. And this argument, in effect, shows that there is no evil genius, and the argument shows that God would not let us go very far astray from the truth. So the argument runs as follows. First, God exists as an infinite substance, a being that is unlimited. Second, Descartes looks at what deception amounts to. So the evil genius is someone that deceives us. The question here is, can God deceive us in this sort of way? And what Descartes says is that deception is an imperfection. A being that deceives is an imperfect being. And it's an imperfection insofar as it limits God's goodness. God's goodness would be less if he were to engage in deception. So it follows from these first points that God exists and is not a deceiver. It further follows from this that there is no evil genius. God would not permit such a being to exist, because such a being's existence would, in effect, amount to God performing an act of deception. If God's responsible for creating everything, he would also be responsible for creating the evil genius, and thereby be responsible for the evil genius's deception. But it likewise follows from this argument so far that we can rely on the clarity and distinctness rule. And we can rely on it because what we perceive clearly and distinctly is something that we cannot but help believe. If we clearly perceive something, then it seems obvious to us that that thing exists. If we distinctly perceive something, then it seems obvious to us what that thing's nature is. And so we cannot help but believe things that we clearly and distinctly perceive. Now, God has made us such that we cannot help but believe what we clearly and distinctly perceive. And if that were to lead us astray, if clarity and distinctness were not always good guides to the truth, then God, by creating us such that we cannot help but rely on clarity and distinctness, God would be a deceiver. Therefore, God's existence shows that the clarity and distinctness rule is something that's a good guide to the truth. And with this, Descartes thinks he's established a firm foundation for the sciences. But now let us consider some objections to what Descartes does in the third meditation. One objection is that we don't really have a clear and distinct idea of God. Our idea of God is something fuzzy, and it's not so determinate as Descartes says. And he really requires that the idea of God have a very determinate content. A second objection to Descartes' argument for God's existence would hold that we don't need to posit that God gives us the idea of God, that God is necessary here for us having the idea of God. Rather, we could put together the idea of God ourselves. So that's by adding up various perfections that we see, amplifying the perfections of the various things that we see, and by putting together those various perfections into one idea, the idea of God. And so what this means is that the idea of God would come from us, not from God himself. This objection doesn't show that God doesn't exist, but it gives an alternative explanation for the idea of God, and then we would need some other argument to show that God exists if we wanted to prove that. A final objection here is that the term God is a mere name with no corresponding idea or image. In other words, that we use this word God, but it doesn't really have any determinate content at all. But let us turn to the most famous and important objection to what Descartes does in the third meditation. This objection is not so much directed against Descartes' proof for the existence of God, but rather directed to the reason why Descartes wants to prove God's existence. So this comes from Antoine Arnauld. What Arnauld says is that Descartes perhaps has committed a vicious circle. In other words, that he's engaged in circular reasoning. And this is how Arnauld formulates this worry. Arnauld writes, quote, Descartes says that we have no other basis on which to establish that what we clearly and distinctly perceive is true than that God exists. So that's the first part, that we're justified in holding the clarity and distinctness principle in virtue of having a proof of God's existence, that God's existence justifies the clarity and distinctness principle. That part is fine, but what is problematic is the next part taken together with this first thing. Arnauld points out that Descartes' argument for God's existence, that its justification relies itself on the clarity and distinctness principle. In other words, what Arnauld is saying is that we prove God's existence in order to support clarity and distinctness as a guide to the truth, but in proving that God exists in the first place, we already are using the clarity and distinctness principle. And so we don't get an independent reason or independent proof of clarity and distinctness. Rather, we're using clarity and distinctness to support clarity and distinctness. And this comes out in how Descartes presents his argument in third meditation for God's existence. He'll often say things like, by the light of nature, or by the natural light of reason. So the idea there is that by this light of reason, we know things like nothing comes from nothing. But Arnauld is pointing out, well, what are you saying there? It seems like what you're saying is that it's clear and distinct that nothing comes from nothing. You're just relying, Descartes, on clarity and distinctness in believing the various premises of your argument for God's existence. So this objection is why most philosophers think that Descartes' project in the Meditations doesn't really hold up, that his project of finding a firm foundation for the sciences relies on a principle that is not justified, the principle of clarity and distinctness. Now, I don't think Descartes' argument is as obviously circular as Arnauld says. And that's because Descartes might have resources available to him to distinguish clarity and distinctness from what he calls the light of nature. But getting into that would be to get into material for a more advanced course on Descartes or early modern philosophy.